Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us here today. My name is Lillian Patil. I am the Senior Analyst of State and Local Budgets at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, where we work with affected communities and justice system stakeholders to eliminate justice system fees and ensure that any fines are fairly imposed and enforced. Today's budget webinar is focused on a topic which I know is timely for so many of you as we head into budget hearings and legislative session season, where legislators are going to be increasingly looking at the fiscal impacts of any policy proposals that they are considering, including fines and fees reforms. And today is all about lifting up the costs that governments must incur to maintain the status quo of fines and fees systems, and the relative savings that governments can see and that we want to lift up and highlight by reforming or eliminating those fines and fees. So our goals today are to start with a little bit of context setting about why this conversation is really so important to the fines and fees reform story, and then to look at 4 concrete different government costs that go into maintaining fines and fees at the state and locals level. For each of these costs, we're going to talk through an example and also give you a base formula that you can use to start to quantify that cost in your own jurisdiction for your own purposes and conversations with policymakers. And then I'm really excited that we have Cole Allen with us here today from the Oklahoma Policy Institute, and he's going to be talking through how Oklahoma has really put all these tools to practice and done a deep dive cost of collections analysis to try and understand the Oklahoma's cost of maintaining the status quo of fines and fees reform. So you'll get to hear about that great work from him directly, and then we'll leave some time at the end, as always, for Q&A. We also have a Q&A chat here on the webinar that our comms team will be monitoring. So please feel free to put in questions at any time as we go through. If we don't get to your question in the moment as we're going through the webinar, we will make sure to leave those few minutes at the end for Cole and myself to answer any questions you may have. Also, a reminder that we are recording this webinar, and afterwards we will be putting it up on our YouTube channel with our other budget webinars, where you can access and view these webinars for free at any time. All right, so let's dive straight into this context setting question, which is, why is talking about the cost of the status quo important to the fines and fees reform story? And that's because for justice system fines and fees, they almost always are at least attempting to extract money from people interacting in the justice system and bring in collections as some form of revenue into the government. And so when you look at changing or reforming those practices and those collection systems, there often can be either the illusion of or an actual revenue impact, or changing the way that money is coming in from collections into the government. And legislators often focus a lot on that story to understand how it impacts the fiscal picture of budgets or jurisdictions when you do those fines and fees reforms. But equally important, in order to see the full fiscal impact, is to understand what's happening not just on the revenue side, but on the spending side. True fiscal impact of any policy change is a sum of the change of revenue plus the change in government spending or expenditure associated with that policy change. And so when we think about fines and fees reform, you're not only going to see a revenue impact from no longer collecting a certain fine or fee, but you are likely going to see an impact from no longer having to spend money in government expenses to try and collect those fines and fees in the first place. And if you can't see that full story, it is hard to get a really good sense of how fines and fees reforms will ultimately benefit both people and also governments in the long run and their budgets. There's been a lot of research that shows really clearly that it is really expensive and often really inefficient for governments to try and collect fines and fees, which is not surprising because we know that fines and fees are disproportionately imposed on low-income communities in the first place. And so people simply often can't afford to pay, no matter the attempts made at collecting those fines and fees. One of the most famous examples of doing research on the cost of the status quo comes from the Brennan Center for Justice, which in 2019 put out a report analyzing in a bunch of different counties how much governments were incurring in costs to try and collect on fines and fees for a few different types of direct costs. And they found that in a lot of cases, counties were spending a majority of what they were making in the first place to try and collect on fines and fees. And in some cases, were even having to spend more than they ultimately took in, resulting in a net loss for governments and budgets from the fiscal sense. There's also a report from Wilmington, Delaware, that looked at the cost of collections for red light and parking fines and fees and found that the government, because of the cost of collections, was only netting in 44 cents to every dollar, or instead of every dollar that was collecting, because of all the costs associated with it. And one more statewide example that I want to show you here comes from Washington. In 2003 to 2004, a report showed that their fines and fees, or their legal financial obligations, were bringing in around $21.6 million that year in revenue from fines and fees collected. But in order to get that money, they were spending $15.8 million, largely on payroll for county clerks whose sole job it was to try and collect this money. And so if you add those two numbers together to get the full fiscal picture, you end up with a much smaller fiscal benefit of only $5.8 million, or 25% of collections. And so that's a much smaller number that you're working with, and a really important fuller picture to be able to share with legislators so they understand the relative consequences of no longer collecting those fines and fees. It also just goes to show how insanely inefficient this collection system is as a method of revenue generation, in addition to, of course, being incredibly inequitable and having really stark impacts on the people from whom the money is extracted in the first place. If we juxtapose this with other broad-based tax sources, we can see that the IRS, meanwhile, is only spending a third of a penny to collect a dollar. And when you compare that with how much cost governments are putting in to collect on fines and fees, we see how extremely inefficient and how costly this system of maintaining the status quo of fines and fees really is. And so again, this is just such an important picture to lift up in general to policymakers, and especially right now, when cost-saving reforms are particularly attractive for state and local governments heading into the next budget hearings and legislative session over the next few months. And that's because we have fiscal conditions showing slowing state and local revenue growth relative to the last few years. We have federal funding cuts that have been administered by the federal administration through the reconciliation bill and other avenues. And we have ongoing economic certainty around tariffs and other domestic and international policy decisions. All of this causing a lot of states and local governments to be nervous around upcoming budget deficits or holes in balancing their budgets, and trying to come up with fiscal solutions for the next coming years. And so I think it's very likely that in a lot of state and local jurisdictions that we're going to see government strategies really prioritizing different policy reforms and ways to either find new revenue or maintain revenue, or to find new ways to cut government costs to help with that budget balancing puzzle. We know from extensive research that fines and fees are bad at this first strategy, right? They are bad at maintaining or raising revenue, again, because you're disproportionately trying to get money from people who largely don't have the money in the first place to pay. What today's webinar is really focused on is showing us how fines and reforms can be great at this second strategy, finding ways to cut government costs. So that's what we're going to get into. And we're going to look at 4 concrete ways that governments do incur those costs and how those costs can turn into savings if you enact fines and fees reform. Again, for each one of these, we're going to give you a template formula to think about and work with in your own jurisdiction. This will, of course, need to be formulas that are customized for what you know about your particular jurisdiction and the way that fines and fees collections processes work in each jurisdiction, but we hope that it is a helpful and concrete starting point to build that conversation, build those numbers, and work from there. The first kind of cost we're going to talk about is your basic cost of collection. And so this is really looking at the human resources, right? The labor, time, and effort that various state or local employees must put into trying to collect on fines and fees in the first place. So this can range from the time and resources of court clerks, folks in the administrative office of the courts, or maybe folks in a particular collections agency, again, depending on how your jurisdiction has set up fines and fees collection systems. It's looking at the time, resources, and labor of judges who must assess and consider and enforce and deal with non-payment of fines and fees at so many different points in their judiciary activities. It's looking at the activities that law enforcement must undertake to try and address warrants, to enforce fines and fees collection, to deal with non-payment, to book and arrest people for non-payment. All of these different things that take up time, that take up money, that take up costs. If you're looking at automated traffic enforcement, like red lights cameras or speeding cameras, you'll usually have a group of employees who are partially or solely hired to process and review tickets that these machines are generating. So lots of different types of employees in lots of different agencies who may be responsible for a step in the collections process. And your first step in determining the formula for cost of collections is to really understand in your jurisdiction who is doing that work so that you can kind of pinpoint which employees and how many employees in each type of position is doing that work, and then calculate what that might be costing the government. You also, of course, want to look at payment to any third-party vendors if contracts are used for the collections process in your jurisdiction. And then, of course, you want to look at something as granular as materials and supplies that are used in the collections process. This is as basic and granular as like the cost it takes to mail out and put stamps on fines and fees outstanding notice payments to people, which may seem like small costs, but certainly can add up. So in looking at how to calculate this cost of collection, here's our suggested base formula. Again, this will require customization based on your jurisdiction and what's going on in your jurisdiction, but we're going to look at this annual payroll cost, the cost it takes to pay people to do this collection work. And it's made up of 3 pieces of data. So first, you want to understand and slot in the number of employees of a particular classification or employee type that are doing this work, times the annual salary and benefits that they are paid, times the amount of their time that they are spending in percentages on fines and fees and collection work in particular. You'll want to run this formula for each different classification or type of employee who is involved in the collections process to your knowledge, and you'll add up all those costs together. Then you want to add in the annual cost of any materials and supplies related to fines and fees collections, as well as any annual contract spending to a third-party vendor, if applicable. What you'll get is then this total number that, again, is mostly based on a payroll cost, the cost of paying employees to do a certain type of work that they are only having to do because this fines and fees system exists. It is important to note, because we're looking at payroll costs here, this doesn't necessarily translate directly into dollars saved that the government can reallocate to something else if fines and fees are no longer collected. Because, of course, unless you're going to fire the employees, which is unlikely, employees still need to get paid. They still need to make their payroll. But what it does mean is that it frees up those employees' time and valuable resources to pursue other justice and public safety goals. And in a time where at the state and local level, public safety departments and justice systems are pretty consistently understaffed and overworked, this is an incredibly valuable thing in the first place. I also want to mention, if you know that the department where these employees are located have a lot of vacancies in them, so a lot of empty positions that aren't filled, but may have the payroll budget just sitting there waiting for it to be filled, then you could move the budget or the resources to pay that employee onto another vacant position. And in those cases, the original payroll dollars for this employee could be freed up as direct savings that could be allocated to something else. So it, again, just kind of depends on what staffing looks like in the departments that you're particularly interested in looking in. So once you have this formula, you can kind of have start this base conversation of how expensive it is to collect fines and fees. The number of employees and the percentage of time they're spending on collections, those are pieces of information that you might need to do court observation, or you might need to do public information requests, or you might need to do some deep relationship building with folks in the administrative office of the courts to really get the on-the-ground good sense of what those data points are. Salary and benefits data is a little bit easier to find online, so I just want to walk you through quickly how you can do that. Governments generally have to report their median or average salaries for each type of public employees online, and so you can just Google public employee classification reports. I'm going to show you a quick screenshot journey of how I did this as an example for the city of county of Denver, which is where I'm based. So I started out just literally by Googling Denver employee classification salary. Once I was there, it took me to this very promising looking PDF called Pay Ranges and Job Titles. Once I clicked into there, it gave me a bunch of charts listing out every single different type or classification of employee and associated them with a particular pay grade and pay grade code. So I just used Control Search to find clerk, and I found a clerk of court. Then a set of later charts later down in the PDF matched my pay grade and pay grade code to minimum, average, and maximum salaries. And so I'm going to use this midpoint range to isolate a an average salary for a clerk of court in Denver at about $152,000. That's what I can use for my salary number. But that in itself is not enough to get the total cost of paying an employee like a clerk. You also have to add in benefits information, and that can be harder to find in public fiscal documents, but it's an important piece of the puzzle because the cost of providing benefits is often significant. And so you don't want to leave that out when you're looking at the total government cost of collections. So if you can't find that information in your public fiscal documents for your particular jurisdiction, you can use some national averages. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics periodically puts out updated statistics on total cost for government and state employees. And as of September 2025, that total cost was consisting of 61.5% salaries and then 38.5% benefits. And so we can translate our clerk's salary of $152,500 into a total employee cost by dividing it by my statistic that is representative of 61.5% salaries as a national average. If I do that division, what I end up getting is $247,989 as the total employee cost that includes both the salary of the 152K and the rest being benefits. So now I have a more accurate total cost of paying this employee who is doing cost of collections work, and I can put it all together. So if hypothetically I find out there's one clerk working in Denver on cost of collections and they're spending about a third of their time doing so, I can do one clerk times total employee costs of about $248,000 times 1/3 of their year, 33% of their time, and that will get me to a total cost of almost $82,000 per year. Now imagine, as I think would be reasonable, if I find out there is more than one clerk working on cost of collections, then that number multiplies it by itself and becomes a significant cost, a significant number to take into account when you're thinking about what happens if we change this practice, what happens if the clerks no longer need to do this work and can spend all that time and all their resources on doing other important justice projects and activities. Now, ideally, you would want the original fiscal conversations to already be set up to include this information. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll find that fiscal notes may include considerations and numbers similar to the analysis that we just did. A lot of times they don't, and so we want to include that formula for you all to be able to do that work on your own. But I want to show you an example of where it does show up in the fiscal note as well. So this is from a 2021 piece of legislation that Colorado passed, eliminating juvenile fines and fees. And so in the fiscal note, they first cover a picture of what the revenue loss will look like, which was not super significant because not a shocker to anyone probably, but they weren't collecting very much in juvenile fines and fees to begin with. But then they include this separate section specifically on what government savings might look at because government employees no longer need to do the collections work. And they specifically say there will be a reduced workload for staff to no longer create payment plans for collecting the fees and surcharges eliminated in the bill. And they probably did some similar type of formula or analysis to what we just looked at the previous slide. And they estimated that it's about half a full-time employee or FTE's worth of time and effort. And they associate that with a savings of $35,492. So again, really concrete, a really important piece of information to add to the overall puzzle of what the full fiscal impact of fines and fees reform is. Okay, moving on to the second cost we're going to look at here of maintaining the fines and fees status quo, and that's the cost of incarceration for reasons related to outstanding fines and fees. This is looking at the costs that governments must incur to hold someone in jail or prison for outstanding fines and fees reasons. And it includes the costs of meeting people's direct needs while they're in there, for example, the food that jails and prisons must provide, as well as for employees that are needed to staff up at a certain level for the number of people that are incarcerated at that time. We know that there are a lot of different reasons that someone could be incarcerated for something that comes down to outstanding fines and fees, whether that's from incurring a technical parole violation because someone couldn't afford their supervision fee, to someone being arrested on the charge of driving with a license that was suspended for debt-based reasons, or someone being arrested on a failure to pay or a failure to appear warrant, which of course we know is not uncommon. In a recent landscape analysis that FFJC did, fines and fees nationally called Imposing Instability, we found that just among 13 different states, over 2.5 million failure to pay or failure appear warrants were issued. And so every time this happens, governments have to incur specific costs to incarcerate people. And what we're going to be looking at is a formula that tries to measure that direct cost. But I want to be clear that this is always going to be a conservative estimate that you can build with this formula, because it doesn't even include indirect costs that occur in that whole process of incarceration, like original arrest and prosecution, bail hearings. All of the employees and the processes and the costs that go into that also add up the cost. And so what we're going to look at for a formula here of the annual cost of incarceration really is a floor and not a ceiling. Again, it's a way to get this conversation started with concrete numbers for people to sort of like be introduced to, and then you can build the narrative and add in other factors from there. But the base formula we're going to look at here is we're going to take first the number of people in your jurisdiction who are incarcerated for fines and fees reasons per year, and multiply that by the average cost of holding someone in a jail or prison facility for one day or night, and then multiply that by the average number of nights that it's reasonable to expect that someone who's in there for fines or fees reasons might have to stay. Again, some of these data points you may be able to get from budget documents that talk about like performance metrics indicators or annual reports, but some you may need to do freedom of information requests or just build relationships with people who are working inside these systems to get kind of an on-the-ground account and estimate. The average nightly bed cost can often be found in public reports, and here are a few different helpful resources to find data on corrections populations: Prison Policy Initiative, Jail Data Initiative, Bureau of Justice Statistics reports. Also, as many of you may know, it can be more helpful if you're looking for jail data to go to counties directly rather than the state, because not all counties may be required to report statistics all the way up to the state level. So you just want to be careful in thinking about that based on the level and type of jurisdiction that you're working in. Okay, so we're going to talk through an example of what this formula looks like if we take into account some data we have on cost of incarceration in New York City. The reason I'm picking this example is the Comptroller of New York City has in the last few years written a number of helpful reports that give us very helpful concrete data points that we need for our formula inputs. So I think a good example to look at here. So existing data that we know. There was a report that came out in 2021 that reported, according to the comptroller, it costs about $1,525 per day to incarcerate one person. As of 2021, due to inflation, I'm sure that number is higher now. So again, using past years also means it's probably, we're building a more conservative estimate. We also know from a separate comptroller's report in 2017 that there were 161 orders of incarceration specifically due to outstanding fines and fees, and that for each person incarcerated, they spent up to 15 days in prison or imprisoned in jails. And so now I have the data points I need to plug into my formula. To get this estimate of annual cost of incarceration, I'm going to plug in 161 orders of incarceration times the per day cost, $1,525 to incarcerate one person, times, I'm going to assume that people are staying for that maximum end of 15 nights per person on average. If you want to go with a more conservative count, you could cut that in half. You could go scale all the way down to 3 or 1. You can kind of plug in whatever hypothetical data point you want that matches what you think is the most reasonable to assume for your jurisdiction. So customize it as you need to. When I multiply these numbers together, I get about $3.7 million a year that governments are directly incurring in cost to incarcerate people for fines and fees. That is a significant number. That is a number that is significant to understanding the fiscal impact of what happens if we don't do this anymore. You don't have to spend this money. And that's a really important conversation for legislators to be able to have if it's not already lifted up in a fiscal note or fiscal information. I'm just reading a note here real quick. There's a question in the Q&A about the Colorado fiscal note we just looked at, and whether there was advocacy that went on behind the scenes to make sure that savings piece was included. That's a great question. I don't know the answer for sure, not have been behind the scenes. I do know that Colorado fiscal notes generally tend to be very structured. And so it would not surprise me if a sort of routine part of doing a fiscal analysis for that fiscal notes office is looking at any savings implications of revenue changes. I will say that for your jurisdiction, understanding what the fiscal notes standards and process looks like can be very helpful to being able to anticipate whether a fiscal note is automatically going to include a conversation around like government costs of the status quo or not. So you can kind of get ahead of the ball, because I've seen states and local governments vary widely in terms of how detailed fiscal notes may be. Okay, moving on to another cost here, the cost of suspending driver's licenses. So this, again, not uncommon, significant costs that go along with this practice of suspending people's driver's license for failure to pay or failure to appear, which in itself often boils down to a failure to pay fines and fees issue. When we look at the formula for what this cost is, we're going to be calculating the administrative cost of carrying out suspensions and reinstatements. And that's going to be largely a payroll cost, like we looked at with cost of collections. There are a number of other costs associated with this practice. One of those is the negative tax revenue impacts from people not being able to drive when they get a suspended license. Maybe they lose their job, maybe they're not able to get to work, or a license is required for their work. And so they are likely going to have reduced earnings. There's research out there that shows that on average, people lose about $12,700 per year in lost earnings due to a driver's license suspension. And so when people are earning less, that means governments are going to be collecting less. If they're not driving, they're not going to collect gas tax from them. If they're spending less, that probably means less sales tax for government collections. If they're making less, that means less income tax for government collections. And so the implications for taxes for governments is also an incredibly significant conversation to be having, because if the suspension practice is reversed, then you don't see those negative tax impacts anymore. And that can directly translate to more money collected in revenue for governments. And then, of course, there are various costs associated with the process of arresting and prosecuting people for driving while on a suspended license, which is not an uncommon charge. And so all of the different people that are involved in that process and hearing time and capacity and cost involved in that process is just additional costs that, again, make the formula that we're going to be looking at a conservative estimate, if anything. So when we look at this, how to estimate cost, we're going to look at an annual administrative cost. This is going to look very similar to cost of collections. You're going to look at the number of DMV or public safety employees that are doing suspensions or reinstatement related work due to fines and fees reasons. You're going to look at the salary and benefits that employee makes, and then you're going to look at the percent of time of their work that they are spending doing that work. You'll do that again for as many classifications of employees as you need. Add in any materials and supplies costs, and add in any contract costs as well, if relevant for your jurisdiction. Again, because this is payroll-based government costs we're looking at, remember that it doesn't necessarily mean that if you end the practice of suspending licenses, that you're going to have direct payroll dollars saved that you can reallocate, because employees still need to get paid, but they can direct their time, attention, and valuable resources to other kinds of work that are needed. And depending on what vacancies look in the department, you could see some direct savings as well. And I see a note here about there are similar costs for freezing vehicle registrations for delinquent fines. Thank you for that helpful comment. And just a reminder that there are certainly always going to be sort of other types of costs that are related to this, but maybe not mentioned in the specific formula that you're going to want to customize for what you know about your own jurisdiction and what may be happening more often than not in your jurisdiction in particular. Okay, so an example here we're going to look at is in Texas. That a few years ago ended the practice of collecting surcharges on certain moving vehicle violations, which was wrapped up in this driver responsibility program. And then if you couldn't pay the surcharges, your license was suspended. This is another example, and Texas does tend to have pretty detailed and structured fiscal notes. So this is another example where the fiscal note does that analysis and brings that conversation up in the first place, which is great. So I'm going to screenshot where it talks about that piece. After talking about the revenue loss they expect to occur from no longer collecting on the surcharges, they mention a very significant cost. They say the total cost of administering the program is an estimated $14.3 million per year. And that's made up of paying 43 different full-time employees to do the process of collecting surcharges and administering suspensions as needed. And then also sending $11.4 million each year to a vendor that also supported with collecting surcharges and possibly also dealing with suspensions related activities. And so very clearly here, this is showing a significant cost, many millions of dollars that needs to be factored in and taken into account when you're looking at the total fiscal impact of repealing this practice or in this program. So very helpful that the fiscal note included it. If it didn't, it would be something that advocates, that stakeholders would want to still be having conversations with legislators about, so that full picture is being realized when the trade-off conversations and policy decisions are being made. How common is it for jurisdictions to include cost savings in their fiscal notes? So again, this is really just a question of how the fiscal note process works. I would not say I have found it to be very common. I get very excited when I see fiscal notes that take into account cost savings because I just don't see it a ton. I do think that continued advocacy from people both outside the system and stakeholders within governments on the importance of including these kind of things in fiscal notes can be important and can be impactful in helping government stakeholders think about how to have those conversations and represent them in fiscal notes moving forward. All right, last cost we're going to be talking about here is the cost of social safety net program needs. And this is probably the squishiest of formulas to build because it can be really hard to get concrete data points on this cost, which is basically the cost of providing basic assistance needs through public assistance programs like SNAP, WIC, emergency shelters, rental assistance programs, providing that assistance to people who may need it because primarily their income has to go to paying off their fines and fee, or the debt hanging over their heads from fines and fees is preventing from being able to meet those basic needs on their own. And so we're going to talk through how to overcome some data limitations around this and how to come up with illustrations and estimates. And I do think that this is a conversation that may resonate in particular with state governments at this moment in time, because state governments are about to, for the first time, have to shoulder a portion of direct costs for SNAP, causing some very big budget concerns looking ahead to the next fiscal years. And so I think tapping into that consideration in that context that I think a lot of legislators are already thinking really closely about, like how states are going to afford this, how they are going to deal with the budget gaps that may be involved in shifting that cost from the federal to the state governments, is going to be really relevant and a helpful conversation for them to have to understand the connection and the link between cost savings they could see if they no longer maintained these inequitable and inefficient fines and fees practices. So ideas on how to estimate these costs. Again, this formula is like a little bit more nuanced than the ones we looked at before, but again, still can be really helpful to set the floor for the conversation, start with a concrete number, and then kind of move the narrative along from there. So the first thing you're going to want to do is get a sense of how many people in the jurisdiction you're interested in owe fines and fees in the first place. Once you have that kind of universe in mind, then you want to take a percentage of that group who you think it's reasonable to assume have had to cut back on a certain type of basic need that may require public assistance. So like being able to buy groceries or being able to afford rent. I know it can be hard to get this information on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. Luckily, we have some really strong proxy statistics in national reports that have come out about this very thing. FFJC a few years ago put out a report called Debt Sentence, which is a 10-year look and survey asking people about their outstanding fines and fee debt and how that has impacted their ability to make their basic needs. And there are some powerful percentage statistics in there about what percentage of respondents with outstanding fines and fees had to cut back on certain basic needs or weren't able to afford certain things like groceries, rent, healthcare. Urban Institute also does an really awesome annual well-being and basic needs survey. And for the past 2 years, they've included in that survey specific questions about whether people owed fines and fees related to the criminal justice system, and if so, how that has impacted their basic needs. And so that's an annual snapshot, so a little bit of a different type of methodology for the surveys, but similarly is able to present percentages of respondents who had trouble meeting certain basic needs. And so you can use those statistics as a proxy or substitute to plug in and multiply by the population that you know of in your jurisdiction. Then multiply that by a per person government cost of administering a certain basic need program, such as emergency shelters, such as rental assistance, such as food assistance. Multiplying all those together will give you this possible top cost of program assistance that the government is incurring due to fines and fees practices, which is not to say that that assistance isn't needed in this moment. It's to say that if you stop collecting fines and fees, people might not need to depend on this assistance, and that can translate to government savings. So in order to do that, though, you do have to often overcome some data limitations, as well as in some of the formulas we looked at in the past. There's sometimes when it's just hard to get the data you need. So I want to really quick touch on suggestions for how to overcome some of those data limitations. The first is what we just did, which is to use proxies or substitutes using national representative or reasonably comparable statistics from somewhere else. So an example of that is I have my clerk's salary that I found in Denver. If I was looking for a similar salary range for a clerk in Colorado Springs, but I couldn't find that data, I might say, because they're cities that are near to each other, I'm going to assume that a clerk would be making a similar amount of money and just substitute the Denver salary. You can also present hypotheticals. So this is using your if-then statement to say, I don't know for certain that this is true, but if it's true, then this is what the cost looks like. And that can be incredibly powerful, again, to present an illustration and a possibility from which to build a conversation and a narrative about costs and cost savings. So an example might be, we don't know how many people in this particular city depend on SNAP specifically because of the fines and fees burden we have. But even if we assume that only 5% of this population are on SNAP because they're dealing with fines and fees debt, then that's still, do the math, X amount of money per year. Imagine if it was 10%, imagine if it was 15%. Just being able to attach a number to that hypothetical can be really powerful in and of itself. And then the third strategy suggestion is to share existing data as a base. So if you wanted to see how many people are incarcerated for outstanding fines and fees in Oregon, but you didn't have that number, but you do have it for the city of Portland, you might say, at a minimum, we know that in Portland, the cost looks like this. Now imagine what it could look like statewide. Again, coming up with a number as a base, a floor, not a ceiling, to start off the conversation. So I'll show you examples of using all of these strategies when looking at a savings analysis that the state of New York might see for saving on basic assistance programs if fines and fees practices were to be reformed to end the practice of collecting surcharges in New York. So we did this analysis as FFJC did this analysis a couple of years ago, and we had already come up with a good estimate of the population of people in New York City that owed outstanding fines and fees. So we had that base data point. We didn't know exactly how many of that population was having to access emergency shelter because of their fines and fees burden. But we did know from the debt sentence and report that nationally, 27% of respondents were reporting experiencing housing insecurity. So we use that percentage as a proxy to offer a start to the conversation. And then we said, okay, does that still make you nervous because you think it's too vague or it's a national statistic and not specific to New York? Let's go even further into conservative land. Let's present a hypothetical where we said, okay, maybe we assume out of everyone that owes outstanding fines and fees, not 27% need emergency shelter, but even only 1%. If only 1% of New York City residents who owe fines and fees needed to use emergency shelter services for 1 month, that still costs the city $6 million. That's a significant number in itself using a very conservative hypothetical. And then we go even further to share some existing data as a base. So we say this only takes into account New York City. If we look statewide, it's not hard to imagine that the costs the governments incur could be as much as double. I'm not saying for sure that it is, but I'm saying it's not hard to imagine. I'm painting this illustration to help move forward the conversation and true understanding of government costs. Okay, that is where I'll stop in terms of building on concrete formulas. Now I want to turn it over to Cole Allen from the Oklahoma Policy Institute to talk about how this kind of work plays out in real life and the process of going about getting data and doing that collections of analysis work. Cole, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Like she said, my name's Cole Allen. I am a policy analyst at the Oklahoma Policy Institute. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that advocates for more equitable and fiscally responsible policies that benefit everyday Oklahomans. And one of those policies that we've worked on for a long time has been fines and fees reform. We started this work really in 2017, so that's 8 going on 9 years now. And over the years, Oklahoma has seen some really big reforms when it comes to fines and fees. A few years ago, we passed legislation that allows judges greater discretion to waive or reduce outstanding fees for individuals that they deem to be indigent. And that's been a huge boon to our work and helping people get out of this debt. And this past legislative session, with the help of groups like FFJC, as well as great state partners, we were able to actually eliminate some criminal fees, which has been huge. But as the momentum for fee reform has been building over the past few years, we've started to notice that legislators get really squirrely about the fiscal impact, especially in Oklahoma, where we've been seeing some tax cuts happen, and dealing with the revenue loss from that makes potential revenue loss from fee elimination, even if they morally agree with eliminating the fees, makes it harder to justify. And so we've been working this past year to get some understandings of what these savings might look like so that fiscal notes might have some more nuance, or we can start imagining what the future might look like when we eliminate the rest of the fees. So can we go to the next slide, please? So to do this, we have started small. We're looking at one single county in Oklahoma for one fiscal quarter. We wanted to start small because I wanted to get a better understanding of behind the scenes what data is available, what kind of costs are ongoing that we can't see from public-facing data, and build out a system from there to hopefully expand our research. So we chose to look just at Cleveland County, Oklahoma, which is this green county right here. And it is the third largest county in the state of Oklahoma. It's part of the greater Oklahoma City metro area. And I am legally obligated to say it's where the University of Oklahoma is. As an alum, I feel like I have to say that. So in Cleveland County, we are looking at 3 main pieces of data, and it centers around the human capital costs in the courthouse mainly. So the first is the collections data, broken down by fee and case type. So how much money that goes to the court fund comes from a felony case versus a probate case versus a tax lien case. We're also looking at the costs associated with court staff, their fee-related workload, and their funding source. In Oklahoma, at least, our district courts are partly funded by the state and are partly funded by the counties where they're located. So I wanted to get an understanding for both jurisdictions what the ROI looks like, what the return on investment looks like. And finally, we're looking at the judicial costs of those fee waiver hearings that I mentioned. And that's happening specifically through court watching with our amazing allies and partners, the Legal Aid Services of Oklahoma. They are present at many cost dockets across the state, including all of the cost dockets in Cleveland County. And we worked with them to change, not to change anything that they're doing, but just to track the judge's time in the courtroom that they spend on these cost dockets to get an understanding of what it's costing judges time-wise and salary-wise to administer these fee waivers. So why did we choose Cleveland County? If we're going to start small, why not choose a different county? Why Cleveland County specifically? We chose Cleveland County because it was an ideal place to do our research for three main reasons. The first reason was the data. We knew that the data was going to be available and trustworthy. So over the past 8 years, we've been scraping the court websites. We know Cleveland County has consistent data, that it's very good. And through relationships that we built, we know that the court clerk specifically in Cleveland County is very well respected for the data that she keeps, it being detailed and trustworthy. Secondly, logistically, it made a lot of sense for us to do Cleveland County. Like I mentioned, I live in Cleveland County, and so it's easy for me to get to the courthouse, as well as having partners who are already there in these cost docket hearings can very, very easily track the judge's time. And finally, but most importantly, it's the people. So Lillian's talked about building relationships to get this data. And that for me has been probably the biggest part of why this has been successful and my biggest hope for expanding this research. So my allies in the legal aid services actually introduced me personally to the court clerk in Cleveland County. Her name's Marilyn Williams. She's fantastic. And I believe that if it wasn't for one of my trusted allies introducing me to someone that they trust and trust them reciprocally, that this data would be much harder to get and understand. And that's because specifically the court clerk position is pivotal to understanding this data. Can we tap one more time, please? Because the court clerks are great allies and often are the key holders for accessing and understanding the data that we need. I would not be able to estimate how much court time or how much staff time is spent on collecting fines and fees. I wouldn't be able to understand which staff members specifically are doing this or understand their revenue source, who's getting money from the state, who's being paid by the county, which have been very big parts of my research. And without building this relationship, and specifically without being introduced by someone that I trust, this would be much harder to access. And so I'm hoping as I expand my research that the time I spent with Marilyn, the court clerk here in Cleveland County, that will help build institutional trust across other court clerks. And if you don't have a relationship with one already, I highly recommend doing an inventory of your existing network. Do you know any attorneys or advocates or other people who might be in a specific courthouse very often? If so, they probably have an opinion and hopefully a good relationship with the court clerk in that county. That would be an ideal way to be introduced and see if this individual in this county could be a good jurisdiction to start this research in. And if that's not available to you, I would look to see if your state has a court clerks association who is in a leadership position there, who is trusted and respected by their peers, because that to me is a very good indication that they A, have good data, B, that they're willing to work with people, and C, that they might have insights to how this system might be improved. And if that still fails, cold call, email people. If, in my experience, court clerks are very happy to talk about bookkeeping. And so if you want to talk bookkeeping and fiscal stats with them, personally, I found that to be a very easy way to connect with people. And if we can connect with the human costs, the costs of collections are people at the end of the day, mostly, it helps me at least make sure that the reforms I'm advocating for are equitable, are sustainable, and are implementable. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So once we get our data, once we do all this stuff, what do we do with it? We've talked a lot about putting them in the fiscal notes, and that is great. That's important to not only give a indication to lawmakers about what reforms will cost, but also it's a great persuasive talking point. Hey, this is really inefficient. We should get rid of this fee. Great. But there's more that we can do with this data. And advocates, I really think, should use this research to do a few things. The first is identifying new allies. So in my research, I've been able to compare the cost and collections, the ROI for Cleveland County, as well as the state of Oklahoma. They're two very different numbers. And to me, that indicates that I can lean and I should do more advocacy at the county level, both with county employees as well as taxpayers in this county who might be interested in knowing how their tax dollars are being spent. If they aren't connected to the fines and fees issue as a criminal justice issue, some might be connected to it as a taxpayer issue, as a government efficiency issue. Secondly, we need to think about cost of collections, not just as a fiscal cost, but there are opportunity costs. We're spending staff time and taxpayer dollars collecting all these fees, or trying to, when we could be directing that to other sources. So when I'm thinking about how to leverage this research, leverage these findings, it's not just to add on to the fiscal note to give it more nuance. It's to say, once these reforms pass, we now have X amount of dollars, X amount of staff time that we can direct towards pretrial hearings, or that we can direct towards making sure that indigent defenders can have better access to their clients. This helps us imagine what the future can look like more specifically and more optimistically once we get our reforms passed. And finally, most importantly, I think that advocates need to use these numbers not on their own, not siloed, not only in the context of tax dollars, money in and out, but in concert with the human costs of this system. I know many people get into this work, me including, because we care about the human costs of the fines and fees system. It makes communities less safe, it tears apart families, it places people in cycles of debt and poverty. We can't forget that. We can't forget that there are people behind the numbers, both in the impact of the fee system, but also in the costs, the fiscal cost of administering it. These are people's jobs, their bills, their kids' tuition. We need to keep that in mind as we talk about reforms and as we use these new fiscal dollars, this new fiscal data in our advocacy. Because at the end of the day, reform isn't tied to a spreadsheet. It is found in people. I would love it if I could just make the perfect Excel file and send it to lawmakers, and then they pass all the bills and they know what it means. But I have to work with people and think about people who are impacted by changes that we make. And at the end of the day, that's what's important, and that's what we need to keep in mind. So with that, I would like to thank you all, and happy to answer any questions that you have. And if you don't have time to put in the Q&A, please feel free to email here at callen@okpolicy.org. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Cole. I think it's really powerful, as you said, to not only talk about numbers and formulas, but see how this plays out in real life and really understand how it's connected to human beings and their lives, and looking at cost impacts on all sides. So we have a few minutes left to be able to talk through any questions that folks might have either for Cole or myself. I also want to mention before we get into any more Q&A that in the next few days, as a follow-up to this webinar, we will be sending out a cost of calculator tool. It's going to be an Excel spreadsheet, and it's going to be an input tool that you can use to try and start playing around with these types of formulas on your own and input data you may have to see what costs of collection, other costs of the status quo may be looking like in your own jurisdiction. So we hope that's a helpful accompanying resource to this webinar, and happy to answer any questions after you get that about like how to make sure that you're using it in a way that feels useful. And we'll also send around a feedback survey in that same email so that you can tell us what was useful about this webinar, what is useful about the tool, and what would be more useful later down the line. With that, please feel free to put any other questions you have in the Q&A. I saw an earlier question that I didn't get to respond to that was just remarking upon how very expensive it is to incarcerate someone in New York City. And I was similarly opened my eyes really wide when I saw that number, and really, I think, reinforces the point that it's so important to bring up these kinds of costs because they are so significant, but so often not talked about in the context that they need to be talked about. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, so I see a question from Abbas. So in my experience, it was really helpful for me to talk with the court clerk directly, and she was able to provide me immediately with that information, both the salary and benefits broken down, specifically how much money is going into their retirement, how much money is going into their health care, as well as being able to come up with estimates, accurate estimates of how much time they're spending. So my recommendation, if at all possible, build a relationship with the court staff because they will have the best, most accurate information for that. And if not, I think Lillian did a really good job of showing how to collect the salary information. And if you need to do a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act, that's a way to calculate the time spent. But I always lean on the relationship building first. Lillian?
Nope, I think that covered it. Just we'll add that those costs like healthcare and retirement go into the package of benefits costs. And so if you can't get those costs at a disaggregated level, again, you can use those national representative statistics to collect the benefits costs as a whole and add them to your salary costs. I'll check for any other questions.
I see a question from Peter about advocacy around public agencies using third-party collectors. So that's something that right now I'm trying to figure out in Oklahoma. The contract is not actually with a state agency, it's with the private sheriff's association here in Oklahoma. So I've been trying to figure out where that contract lives. But I think talking about this right now, for years has been an ongoing case, lawsuit brought against the state of Oklahoma, as well as the debt collection agency that we have contracted with. And I think if that is something that exists in your state, looking at the money that it costs the state to litigate these things is one solid number that we can use to talk about the cost of this. Lillian, do you have anything?
No, that was a great response. Thank you. Let's see. I see a new question here about, have you run into the issue about how some city budgets depend on costs or fees? You can certainly see that play out in budgets where you may see specific revenue lines for fines and fees that are built in order to fund a certain department's activities or going into straight to the general fund. And legislators understandably may be nervous about losing revenue, especially in these tighter fiscal times. But I think this conversation is one that's really relevant to that, of helping legislators understand that not only are they going to potentially see some changes to revenue, but they're also going to see changes to cost. They're going to see savings to cost that can net out to mean that there isn't a significant fiscal impact, or sometimes can even be an overall savings as a result of implementing fines and fees reforms. We also have a number of other webinars that are up on our FFJC YouTube channel that get into much more depth about how to follow the money and understand how much dependence there actually is versus like the perception of dependence, which can sometimes be a little bit different. So also recommend checking those out if you're interested. Cole, anything else to add there?
Nope, I think you covered it very well.
Okay, well, we are just about at time for this webinar. I want to thank you all for coming to this webinar and for your questions, and reminding you all that you should see an email come through from us in the next few days with that accompanying resource that my colleague Alejandra has developed specifically for this webinar and using those tools. And we hope that's helpful to you. Please do fill out the feedback survey to let us know what isn't helpful and how we can be helpful with webinars and budget education tools in the future. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.